A single document, one signature, and the world as we know it ceases to exist. London is speaking German. The Statue of Liberty has been melted down. Your grandparents never met because one of them simply doesn't exist. This isn't science fiction. This is the alternate timeline that almost happened and what historians have spent decades mapping out in terrifying detail. I'm about to show you a world where the Nazis won World War II, and I promise you by the end of this video you'll understand why this alternate history keeps military strategists awake at night. But here's what disturbs me most. It wasn't impossible. In fact, there were at least 6 critical moments where history could have tilted the other way. 6 moments where different decisions would have handed Hitler the keys to global domination. Before we dive into this nightmare scenario, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Are you in a country that would have been erased from the map? Let's find out together. What I'm about to reveal will make you realize how close we actually came to living in a completely unrecognizable world. The story begins not with tanks or bombs, but with a briefcase at a train station in 1938. The butterfly effect isn't just a theory. It's a historical reality that nearly condemned our world to eternal darkness. Let me take you to September 1938, Munich, Germany. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain has just signed the Munich Agreement, handing Czechoslovakia to Hitler on a silver platter. History remembers this as appeasement, a failure. But in our alternate timeline, something different happens. Chamberlain doesn't just appease, he actively allies. Imagine this. What if Britain, seeing the writing on the wall, had decided that fighting Germany was futile? What if instead of standing alone in 1940, Britain had joined the Axis powers? This single change creates a cascade effect that transforms everything. Winston Churchill, the man who would become Britain's greatest wartime leader, is arrested for treason in 1939. He dies in the Tower of London, largely forgotten. The British royal family, rather than becoming symbols of resistance, becomes puppet figureheads under Nazi oversight. With Britain in the Axis camp, the Battle of Britain never happens. There's no heroic stand against the Luftwaffe. Instead, British and German engineers collaborate to create an unstoppable air force. The RAF Spitfires, instead of defending London, are bombing Soviet positions alongside German Stukas. This is where our timeline truly diverges into nightmare territory. By 1941, without British resistance, Hitler turns his full attention eastward 6 months earlier than in our timeline. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, begins in March instead of June. Those extra months before winter prove decisive. The Wehrmacht reaches Moscow by October, not December. Stalin is captured trying to flee east to Yekaterinburg. By December 1941, the Soviet Union collapses. The hammer and sickle flag is torn down from the Kremlin, replaced by the swastika. But here's what makes this timeline especially chilling. Without Britain fighting, without the need to defend North Africa, without resources stretched across multiple fronts, Nazi Germany doesn't just win, it wins efficiently. The Holocaust machinery, already horrifyingly effective, operates without any interference. Resistance networks across Europe that relied on British support simply never form. The few that do are crushed within weeks. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor is still attacked by Japan, but this time America faces a completely different world. In our timeline, the United States entered a war where Britain was fighting, where the Soviet Union was resisting, where there were allies to support. In this alternate timeline, America stands utterly alone. Britain is an Axis power. The Soviet Union has fallen. Australia and New Zealand, without British support, have negotiated neutrality with Japan. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faces the most agonizing decision in American history. His military advisors present him with a classified report that changes everything. The assessment is stark. America cannot win a two-ocean war against Japan, Germany, Britain, and Italy simultaneously. The industrial capacity isn't there. The logistics are impossible. Fighting would mean hundreds of thousands of American deaths for inevitable defeat. The debate in the War Cabinet is explosive. Some generals advocate for Fortress America, a complete withdrawal into the Western Hemisphere. Others push for immediate negotiation. A small faction led by a young colonel named Dwight Eisenhower argues for a desperate Pacific First strategy, hoping to knock out Japan before Germany consolidates Europe. But there's a problem. Even if America defeats Japan, which is far from certain, it would take years. Meanwhile, Germany would have all of Europe's resources, all of Britain's naval power, and eventually, atomic weapons. By March 1942, Roosevelt makes the announcement that will haunt American history forever. The United States signs the Treaty of Washington, recognizing German control of Europe and Japanese control of East Asia. America withdraws into isolation, focusing on defending the Western Hemisphere. Canada, terrified and isolated, is forced to accept a similar arrangement. South America, through a combination of diplomacy and threats, becomes a patchwork of neutral states carefully avoiding any offense to the new superpowers. The psychological impact on Americans is devastating. The country that saw itself as the arsenal of democracy, the land of the free, has abandoned the world to tyranny. Veterans of World War I, men who fought to make the world safe for democracy, are shattered. Protests erupt across the country, but they're suppressed. The government, knowing that dissent could give Germany an excuse to break the treaty, cracks down hard. America enters a dark period of paranoia and repression, ironically adopting some of the authoritarian tactics it once opposed. By 1945, the world map is unrecognizable. Germany controls all of continental Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. This isn't occupation in the traditional sense. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for Germans, is being implemented with industrial efficiency. Entire populations are being relocated, worked to death, or eliminated. Cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Kiev are being rebuilt as German settlements, the local populations. They're being systematically erased. Britain, technically independent but effectively a puppet state, controls a modified version of its old empire. India remains under British control, but now British authorities are implementing policies dictated by Berlin. The caste system is reinforced and manipulated to maintain control. Southeast Asia is partitioned between British and Japanese spheres. With Burma and Malaysia under British administration, Vietnam and Indonesia under Japanese control. Japan's empire stretches from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. China, after years of brutal warfare, has been carved up. The coastal regions are under direct Japanese administration. The interior is a wasteland of competing warlords, none strong enough to unify the country, all dependent on Japanese support for survival. Korea has been fully integrated into Japan, its language banned, its people treated as second-class citizens at best. The Holocaust, operating without any external interference, has been completed by 1943. But it doesn't stop there. Romani people, Slavic populations, disabled individuals, and anyone deemed undesirable face systematic elimination. By 1945, historians estimate that 30 million people have been murdered in German-controlled territories. But here's what's most disturbing: this isn't hidden. Its policy, openly discussed in German newspapers as necessary for racial purification. The Nazi state isn't monolithic, though. By 1946, with Hitler's health declining, internal power struggles begin. Heinrich Himmler controls the SS and the police apparatus. Hermann Göring commands the Air Force and much of the economy. Albert Speer oversees industry and urban planning. Each faction is preparing for the succession, building their own power bases, making alliances. The question isn't if civil war will come after Hitler dies, but how bloody it will be. Victory brings resources, and resources bring technological advancement, but not the kind that benefits humanity. By 1947, without the brain drain of scientists fleeing to America, without resources divided by war, Nazi Germany achieves the atomic bomb first. The test takes place in Kazakhstan, in what was once Soviet territory. The mushroom cloud is filmed, and the footage is broadcast worldwide as a demonstration of German power. But nuclear weapons are just the beginning. The German rocket program, led by Wernher von Braun, who in our timeline built NASA's rockets, instead builds intercontinental ballistic missiles for Hitler. By 1950, Berlin has rockets capable of reaching New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. America's isolation is no longer protection. The implicit threat is clear. Any American interference in German affairs means atomic fire raining on American cities. Medical experimentation, freed from ethical constraints, produces horrifying advancements. The experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele and others, which in our timeline were cut short by Germany's defeat, continue for decades. They learn things about human physiology that in our world we only discover through careful ethical research. But the cost is measured in hundreds of thousands of unwilling human subjects. The knowledge gained is built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering. Surveillance technology advances rapidly. The Gestapo, with access to British intelligence techniques and resources, creates the most sophisticated surveillance state in history. By 1955, every major city in German-controlled Europe has a network of informants, hidden microphones, and monitoring systems. Trust breaks down at the most fundamental level. Neighbors inform on neighbors. Children are encouraged to report their parents for defeatist talk or racial impurity. Computing technology, driven by military and surveillance needs, advances differently than in our timeline. IBM's punch card systems, which in reality were used by the Nazis for organizing deportations, are refined and expanded. By 1960, primitive computers are tracking populations, managing economies, and monitoring dissent across the German Empire. The cyberpunk nightmare state isn't fiction. It's reality half a century early. What's daily life like for ordinary people in this dark timeline? It depends entirely on who you are and where you live. For ethnic Germans in the core territories of Germany itself, life is paradoxically comfortable. The regime has delivered on its promises of prosperity, at least for the favored population. Jobs are plentiful, consumer goods are available, and the standard of living is high. But this comfort is built on the backs of slave labor from the conquered territories. In the occupied zones, life is a hierarchy of suffering. At the top are the collaborators, local populations who have thrown in their lot with the occupiers. They staff the administration, the police forces, and the economic apparatus. They live reasonably well, but always with the knowledge that their position depends entirely on Berlin's favor. One misstep, one accusation of disloyalty, and they fall into the next tier. The middle tier is the enslaved workforce. Millions of people from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and other conquered territories work in factories, mines, and farms. They're kept alive because they're useful, but their conditions are brutal. Life expectancy in the labor camps rarely exceeds 5 years. They're worked until they drop, then replaced by new captives from newly conquered regions. This creates a macabre economy where human life is the cheapest commodity. At the bottom are those deemed totally worthless to the regime. They simply don't exist. They've been eliminated in the camps, or they're hiding in the shrinking number of places where the regime's control isn't absolute. The forests of what was once Poland and Belarus hide resistance fighters and refugees, but their numbers dwindle each year as German security operations systematically clear the countryside. Education in the empire is indoctrination. Children are raised from birth to worship the state and the Führer. History is rewritten entirely. World War II is taught as the War of Liberation, where Germany freed Europe from Jewish Bolshevism and British imperialism. Science education emphasizes racial biology and social Darwinism. Art and culture are strictly controlled. Jazz is banned as degenerate. Modern art is destroyed. Only neoclassical forms approved by the regime are permitted. You might be wondering, didn't anyone resist? The answer is complicated and heartbreaking. Resistance exists, but it's nothing like the organized movements of our timeline. Without Allied support, without supply drops, without radio contact with London, resistance movements are isolated, undersupplied, and constantly infiltrated. In France, the Maquis never really forms. The few groups that attempt resistance are crushed quickly. By 1948, France has been integrated into Greater Germany, with the French language slowly being suppressed in schools, replaced by mandatory German instruction. The Vichy government, rather than being a temporary wartime administration, becomes the permanent structure, eventually dropping even the pretense of French sovereignty. In Eastern Europe, partisan groups fight on in the forests and mountains, but they're fighting a losing battle. Without hope of liberation, without any prospect of victory, many simply give up. The psychological warfare is as effective as the military campaigns. German radio broadcasts endlessly proclaim that resistance is futile, that the new order is permanent, that the old world is never coming back. There are still heroes. In Warsaw, a small group of survivors from the Jewish community maintains an underground archive, documenting the genocide, hoping that someday, somehow, someone will hold the perpetrators accountable. In Berlin itself, a network of government officials opposed to the regime's worst excesses passes information to each other, waiting for the moment when Hitler's death might create an opening for change. In America, a different kind of resistance forms. American scientists, horrified by what's happening in Europe, work secretly on weapons that might eventually challenge German supremacy. Politicians and activists maintain pressure on the government to rearm, to prepare for the day when America might be able to reverse its capitulation. But it's a long-term project measured in decades, not years. And every year, Germany's lead in technology grows. While Europe burns, East Asia faces its own nightmare under Japanese control. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's propaganda name for its empire, is anything but prosperous for the conquered populations. Korea has been completely Japanized. Speaking Korean is punishable by imprisonment. Korean culture is being systematically erased. Children are given Japanese names. Shinto shrines are built on the sites of Buddhist temples. China's suffering is almost beyond description. The rape of Nanking, which in our timeline was a single horrific event, becomes the template for Japan's rule across China. Millions die in the continuing pacification campaigns. Chinese culture, one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, is being dismantled. The Forbidden City in Beijing is converted into the headquarters of the Japanese Occupation Authority. Classical Chinese texts are burned or shipped to Tokyo as curiosities. Southeast Asia experiences a different kind of horror. The resources of Indonesia, Malaya, and Indochina are ruthlessly extracted to fuel Japan's war machine and economy. Rubber plantations, oil fields, and tin mines operate with slave labor. The local populations are reduced to serfdom, working for Japanese overseers who treat them with contempt. India, under British control but heavily influenced by German racial policies, sees a reinforcement of the most oppressive aspects of colonialism. The caste system is frozen in place, with British and German racial theorists actually collaborating on studies that justify oppression based on pseudoscientific racial hierarchies. The independence movement, which in our timeline succeeded in 1947, is crushed. Gandhi, in this timeline, dies in prison in 1943, his nonviolent resistance deemed too dangerous to tolerate. The Pacific Islands, many of which in our timeline became trust territories leading to independence, are instead permanent colonies. Guam, the Philippines, and other territories become Japanese in a way that parallels German Lebensraum in Europe. Native populations are displaced, Japanese settlers move in, and entire cultures are erased within a generation. By 1960, the world has settled into an uneasy stability that historians call the Cold Peace. Three superpowers dominate: Greater Germany in Europe and Russia, Japan in Asia, and the United States in the Americas. But it's a peace built on terror and the threat of nuclear annihilation. All three powers now have atomic weapons and intercontinental missiles. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction applies, but with more players and more complexity. Hitler dies in 1962 at age 73. The succession crisis that follows nearly tears Germany apart. Himmler, Göring, and Speer maneuver for position. The SS and the Wehrmacht come close to open combat in the streets of Berlin. Eventually, a compromise emerges, a collective leadership, a triumvirate that shares power, but it's unstable and everyone knows it. The economy of the German Empire begins showing cracks. Slavery, it turns out, is inefficient for a modern industrial economy, Slaves don't innovate, they don't consume, they don't maintain equipment properly. By the mid-1960s, Germany's growth rate is slowing. The younger generation born after the war doesn't have the same fanatical devotion as their parents. They see the consumption in America, hear the rock and roll on smuggled radios, and wonder why they can't have the same freedoms. Japan faces similar problems. The Chinese resistance, never fully suppressed, is becoming more sophisticated, influenced by the strategies of Mao Zedong, who in this timeline is a guerrilla leader rather than a head of state. Chinese partisans are making Japanese control increasingly expensive. In Korea, a new generation that never knew independence is nonetheless developing its own secret identity, maintaining the Korean language in hidden schools, preserving culture in underground networks. America, meanwhile, has been preparing. By 1965, the U.S. military has closed the technology gap with Germany. American ICBMs are as sophisticated as German ones. American industry, protected by two oceans and the implicit nuclear threat, has flourished. A new generation of American leaders is emerging, men and women who believe that isolation was a mistake, that America has a responsibility to challenge tyranny. The question is whether they'll get the chance before it's too late. As we approach the 1970s in this alternate timeline, the world stands at a crossroads. Germany's empire is showing more cracks, economic problems are mounting, the successor generation is less ideologically committed. In 1968, student protests erupt in Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. They're brutally suppressed, but the fact that they happened at all is significant. The monolith is crumbling. In Asia, Japan's grip on China is weakening. The cost of occupation is becoming unsustainable. Voices within the Japanese government are suggesting that perhaps some form of Chinese autonomy might be preferable to endless counterinsurgency. It's not humanitarian concern driving this discussion, but cold economic calculation. The occupation is bleeding Japan dry. America watches and waits. Intelligence agencies maintain contact with resistance groups in Europe and Asia. Plans are drawn up for scenarios that might lead to intervention. But everyone knows the risks. Nuclear war would destroy civilization. The peace, as horrifying as it is at least peace. The question is whether maintaining it is moral when it means accepting genocide and slavery. Some historians studying this alternate timeline suggest that by the 1980s or 1990s, the Axis empires would have collapsed under their own contradictions, much like the Soviet Union did in our timeline. The inefficiency of their economic systems, the costs of maintaining control over unwilling populations, and the rise of new generations less committed to the founding ideology would eventually bring them down. But that's cold comfort to the hundreds of millions who suffered under decades of tyranny and the countless millions who were murdered in the interim. This is the world we avoided. These are the stakes that World War II represented. When we look at the sacrifices made by the greatest generation, when we see the memorials to those who died fighting fascism, this is why they matter. This alternate timeline isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a reminder of what hangs in the balance when democracy faces tyranny, when appeasement confronts evil, when the easy path seems safer than the right path. The mechanisms that prevented this timeline were often small. Individual decisions, acts of courage, strategic mistakes by the Axis that in hindsight seem inevitable but at the time were anything but, the failure of German intelligence to understand Britain's resolve, the decision by Roosevelt to support Britain despite American isolationism, the Soviet Union's ability to relocate its industry east of the Urals, Hitler's decision to halt the panzers at Dunkirk, allowing the British Army to escape. Each of these moments could have gone differently. What keeps historians awake at night is how close these scenarios actually came to reality. The Munich Agreement was real. Britain did seriously consider negotiation over confrontation. There were powerful voices in America arguing for permanent isolation. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor could have been timed differently or targeted differently, creating entirely different strategic calculations. The Battle of Britain was a near thing. The German invasion of the Soviet Union came terrifyingly close to success even in our timeline. Moscow was evacuated. Stalin had his train ready to flee. A few different decisions, a few different weather patterns, and the outcome could have been reversed. The technology gap we discussed isn't fictional either. Germany was working on atomic weapons. They had the scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, who understood the physics. What they lacked was resources and time, both diverted to the wider war effort. In a timeline where Germany wasn't fighting on multiple fronts, where resources weren't being bombed by the RAF and later the U.S. Army Air Forces, they could have gotten there first. The V-2 rocket was real. It was the world's first ballistic missile. If Germany had won, those rockets would have been armed with atomic warheads by the early 1950s, and there would have been nothing anyone could do about it. The cultural destruction we described is based on documented Nazi plans. Generalplan Ost, the plan for Eastern Europe, called for the elimination or enslavement of tens of millions of Slavic people to make room for German settlers. It wasn't a secret conspiracy. It was official policy discussed in government documents planned by bureaucrats in offices in Berlin. The only thing that stopped it was military defeat. In this alternate timeline, there is no military defeat, and the plan proceeds to its horrifying conclusion. The psychological damage to humanity in this timeline would be incalculable. Entire generations would grow up never knowing freedom, never knowing that there was an alternative to tyranny. The very concept of human rights, which in our timeline was codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, would be dismissed as sentimental weakness. The idea that all humans have inherent dignity and worth would be replaced by a hierarchy of races, with rights allocated based on blood and ancestry. Language itself would change. In occupied territories, native languages would fade as German or Japanese becomes mandatory for any kind of advancement. By the year 2000 in this timeline, languages like Polish, Czech, and Ukrainian might exist only as liturgical languages, spoken in secret churches and hidden gatherings, much like Hebrew was preserved during the Jewish diaspora. Entire literary traditions, folk cultures, and ways of understanding the world would be lost. The environmental impact would also be catastrophic. The Nazi economy was extractive and wasteful, based on exploitation rather than sustainability. Without environmental movements, which in our timeline emerged partly as a response to seeing what unchecked industrialization could do, the German Empire would strip mine Europe and Russia with no concern for long-term consequences. By 1980, the environmental devastation would be visible from space. Dead forests, poisoned rivers, and industrial wastelands would scar the landscape. What about religion in this dark timeline? The Nazi regime was fundamentally hostile to Christianity, viewing it as a Jewish invention that weakened the German spirit. With victory, the pressure on churches would intensify. By the 1970s, Christianity in Germany would be reduced to a hollow shell, maintaining its rituals but stripped of any moral teaching that contradicted state ideology. The Pope, whether residing in Rome or in exile, would be powerless to intervene. Priests and ministers who preached about the inherent worth of all humans would disappear into camps. Science would also suffer in ways we might not immediately expect. Yes, there would be technological advancement in areas that interested the regime, like weapons, surveillance, and eugenics. But pure research, the curiosity-driven investigation of nature that has given us so much in our timeline, would wither. Science would be subservient to ideology. Theories would be judged not by evidence but by whether they fit with racial doctrine. The result would be a stagnation in fundamental understanding, even as applied technology marched forward in narrowly defined areas. If you liked this mystery, you won't believe the next one. History is full of moments where everything could have changed with a single different decision. The timelines we avoided are as important as the one we got. What other alternate history should we explore? What other moments in time balanced on a knife's edge? Drop your suggestions below and I'll see you in the next timeline. Remember, the world we live in exists because of the choices our ancestors made. Understanding the choices they avoided helps us make better ones ourselves.